joining on the phone. We are recording this meeting. Everyone should know that. And that's a good thing. So we can make this available to share with others who couldn't make it today. But thank you all for joining this TDR Summit, which sounds, when you use the word summit, it sounds super important. And I think it is. This is, the TDR program has been something we've been working on for quite some time in Thurston County since 1995. This is a program that's been in place. And every so often, I know some of you have been around quite a long time and have been part of conversations over time, but every so often, we kind of revisit it and say, how's it going? Is it doing what it's supposed to do? And there's been some stops and starts, and this is another one of those starts. So we're hoping that this restarts a community conversation from all the folks who are important to the program, users, policymakers, planners. And that's why you're here, is to have that conversation and kind of get all on the same page about what the program is, what it should be, where it's at, and what might we do differently moving forward if we need to do something different. But first, let's get some logistics out of the way. I'm Jennifer Davis, Thurston County Community Planning Manager. I invited you here. This is part of a larger project that Thurston County is undertaking to examine our agricultural policies and programs, and TDR is a key tool in that. And so we wanted to get folks together and have this opportunity to share information and develop some next steps. I'd like to lay some ground rules. Please mute yourself if you're not talking. That would be helpful for background noise. Please use the raised hand function if you do have a question or a statement to make. That just helps with order. And Polly, if you could help me sort of keep track of that. Sometimes I'm not the best if I'm talking at identifying raised hands. Thank you. And then what we're going to do first is just do a quick round of introductions. There are plenty of us here. I anticipate more will join. And so we're just going to go around. I'll call out your name and you can just say who you are and who you represent. And we'll just get that done in the first few minutes here before we dig deeper into the purpose and goals of the summit and the rest of the agenda. All right, so I am going to start with Commissioner Menser, who I see on my screen, and go for it.
Morning, everybody. Ty Menser, Thurston County Commissioner for District 3.
Thank you. And Council Member Sullivan.
Thank you. Apparently I'm not fast this morning. I'm Debbie Sullivan. I'm Tumwater City Council member, position 6.
All right, and Council Member Madrone.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Danny Madrone. I serve on the Olympia City Council.
All right, and Josh Cummings.
Good morning, Joshua Cummings, the Director of Community Planning and Economic Development, CPED. And I'll likely be moving to the phone, but excited to have this opportunity to learn more.
Awesome. I'll continue with some of the CPED staff who are here today. Brett Burris.
Hi, good morning. Brett Burris. I am the Development Services Manager for Thurston County Community Planning and Economic Development.
Thanks, Brett. Andy DeFobis.
Andy DeFobis, Interim Senior Planner. I'm the current staff person that administers the current TDR program.
All right, Polly.
Hi, I'm Polly Stoker, and I support the CPED department.
And Chris Chapeau.
Good morning, Christina Chapeau, Senior Planner, Community Planning.
All right, and then we'll move to some more of our planners in the house. Leonard Bauer.
Hey, I'm Leonard Bauer. I'm the Director of Community Planning Development at the City of Olympia.
All right, and Brad Medred.
Brad Medred, Planning Manager for the City of Tumwater.
And Ryan Andrews.
Morning, Ryan Andrews, Planning Manager with the City of Lacey.
Awesome. Okay, and we'll jump to some of our other partners and folks in the community, unless I've missed other folks from a jurisdiction. We'll get to everybody. Let's see, Scott Nelson. Oh, you're on mute, Scott.
Scott Nelson, I'm a Thurston County farmer and a member of the Thurston County Planning Commission.
Thanks for being here, Scott. We'll go. We have some people from Commerce. Valerie.
Hi there, Valerie Smith, Senior Planner and Growth Management Services with Department of Commerce.
Thanks for being here, Valerie. And Kirsten Larson.
Kirsten Larson, I'm a Senior Planner with Growth Management Services as well.
Thanks. And Sarah Moorhead.
Good morning and happy Friday, everyone. I'm Sarah Moorhead. I'm the Executive Director at Thurston Conservation District.
Thank you, Sarah. Let's see, Sierra Smith.
I am Sierra Smith with WSU Extension, and I work on the communications with the Sentinel Lands Project.
Great, thanks for being here, Sierra. Jason, again, I don't ever know if it's Gano or Gano. I'm sorry, Jason.
It's all right. Either way works. Jason Gano, Government Affairs Director, Olympia Master Builders, and happy it's raining.
Yeah, Gano, got it. All right, one of our esteemed program users, Liv Monroe.
So I'm Liv Monroe, and I represent the small group of people who have purchased TDRs here.
Thank you for being here, Liv. Can't wait to hear more from you. And then we have a couple guests from, let's first do Loretta. Sorry, Loretta.
Hi, I'm Loretta Seppanen, a community member interested in preserving farmland.
Thanks, Loretta. And then we have some guests who are going to help us understand how TDR works in other jurisdictions. And first is Michael Murphy here from King County.
Good morning, all. Michael Murphy. A lot of people call me Murph, so you might hear our other guest calling me that. I run the TDR program at King County and also work on conservation planning generally, King County.
Thanks, Michael. And then Nick Bratton. I don't know if I said that right, Nick.
Yeah, Nick Bratton, that's me. Thank you for the introduction, Jennifer. Nick Bratton with Torterra, where I am the Senior Director of Policy.
Thanks for being here, Nick. And then some other folks on the line, Betsy DeReed.
Hi, that's Betsy DeVreda. I'm on the Thurston Conservation District Board of Supervisors.
Oh, I apologize for the mispronunciation, Betsy. We do have a couple.
Not unusual.
I'm sure that's true. We have a couple people on the phone. One, it looks like the number ends in 308. You're muted if you're trying to speak. If you're on the phone calling in, go ahead and chime in. You'll need to unmute yourself. Polly, can you remind?
*6. Yeah, *6 to unmute on the phone.
Oh, there's one.
That worked. Thanks, Polly. This is Stephen Bramwell, the Extension County Director for Washington State University in Thurston County and Agriculture Specialist here. Nice to be here.
Thanks, Stephen. And then our other phone caller.
Hi, this is Steve Chamberlain. I'm a private citizen and a land developer, landowner, and I hold several of the TDRs and have since 2008.
Thanks for being here, Steve. Is there anyone I've missed? If so, please chime in now.
Allison Osterberg, staff with Thurston Regional Planning Council.
Can't believe I missed you, Allison. How
No
embarrassing. Who else is there on the phone? I heard another voice from the phone world. Maybe not. Okay. Well, again, thank you. It's a diverse group, as you can see, and this was an invite list that was cultivated really to represent all the different parts of transfer of development rights, policymakers and elected officials, folks who provide technical assistance to our farmers, development community users of the programs, and the planners who make sure these codes are written in a way that actually can be implemented by us all and used by us all. And again, the purpose and the goals of this summit are pretty simple. It's to kind of get together and have a conversation about where we are with our TDR program and where we want to go. And if it's a shared policy priority that we want to invest in as a community. And so the outcomes that we really are seeking from today are just defining some next steps after today. We're all going to learn together in the first half of this agenda about what TDR is, in case some of you have forgotten or remain a little murky on it, how it's supposed to work, how it works in other places, and how it's been working in Thurston County. So we're going to do that the first half of the meeting. We'll have a short break, and then the second half of the meeting is about all of that discussion and questions and talking about what we want to do and where we want to go. And then at the end of the day, we'd like to walk away with a list of potential next steps to carry forward. Those ideas about those were written on the agenda. Those are not the only ideas. So we may have other good minds here who want to share their perspective on what we should do next. Again, Thurston County is hosting this conversation, but TDR is implemented by Thurston County and the cities of Olympia, Lacey, and Tumwater, because those are our receiving areas, and we'll remind everyone what that means in a minute. And then, of course, all of our partners and potential users of the program, from the development community to our farmland owners. We invited key folks from there who really have expressed interest in TDR as a tool locally. We did a community agriculture survey in April of this year, and one of the results of that survey emerged that transfer of development rights remains a priority for folks, and they want to see more done with that. And so that's why we're here as well. With that, I am going to make us all watch a short video that I think will sort of set the table in terms of what TDR is supposed to be. And for some of you, it'll be old hat. And for some of you, you might be able to learn a little bit from watching this video. So I'm going to share my screen and play it. It's not very long. And at the end of it, I'll do a little presentation on kind of how the concepts in the video have been applied here in Thurston County, so we can get on the same page. So I'm sharing. Can everybody see the YouTube video up on your screen? All right, I'm going to click play and we'll all listen together.
This is Elena. Elena just moved to a new city. And honestly, she's feeling pretty great about it. Elena, what do you like about Seattle?
Farmers markets, and I love that you don't have to go far to find some incredibly beautiful things.
Those are all great things, and they're part of what's made this area attractive to newcomers. In fact, lots of people are moving to cities across central Puget Sound. Estimates are that 1.8 million people will be moving to this area in the next 30 years. That's the equivalent to over 2 more Seattles.
That's a lot of people. How do we manage for that?
Good question. Have you heard of TDR, or transfer of development rights? Right. Most people haven't. At its core, TDR aims to manage growth in urban places while avoiding sprawling out onto our open spaces, like our farms and forests.
How does it do that?
In a couple ways, actually. You mentioned you love farmers markets, right?
Yes, I do. I buy the most amazing flowers and broccoli and the most delicious cheese.
Wow, that does look good. Okay, so as the population grows, many farmers face strong pressure to sell their land to developers. TDR lets farmers stay in agriculture by paying them not to build up their property. Once farmers sell their development rights, the land is permanently conserved for farmland or open space. And according to farmer Leanne Kranick, that's a good thing.
It's a very good thing.
Leanne and her husband Mike run Kranick Dairy in Enumclaw, Washington. They sold their development rights in 2017.
The funds that we received from selling the development rights helped us pay off the mortgage, and it also helped us make much needed improvements that benefited the land that we farmed and our animals. We still own our farm, we can still farm it, and it keeps it a farm forever. So where did the development rights go?
Well, as the name TDR implies, they're transferred to use elsewhere, primarily in our cities where transportation options, jobs, parks, and schools already exist. The basic idea, if we build in our cities, we won't build on lands we want to protect. Developer Greg Johnson explains.
Seattle limits its building heights as part of its zoning regulations. But in areas of the city where it wants to encourage growth, like downtown, you're able to gain additional height through the purchase of TDRs. For example, in our Rainier Square project, we gained an additional 12 stories, which on the flip side, conserved over 14,000 acres of land. Another benefit of TDR to urban residents is that cities get more money specifically for infrastructure that supports growth.
All this sounds pretty smart, actually. Is it a totally new thing?
The first local TDR deals go all the way back to 1996, but the program has seen dramatic acceleration over the past few years. The regional sustainability organization Torterra, along with King, Pierce, Snohomish, and Kitsap counties, have together created the largest transfer of development rights program in the country. The partnership spans all of central Puget Sound and includes cities like Tacoma, Bellevue, Sammamish, Shoreline, Mountain Lake Terrace, Normandy Park, plus Seattle, Everett, Issaquah, Arlington, Redmond, and Snohomish so far.
That's a lot. What will it all add up to?
As many as 650,000 acres could be conserved, in part thanks to a regional marketplace Torterra has organized for the buying and selling of TDRs. All of it will help keep this a special place because you want to make this your home, don't you?
I do, yeah.
All right, so I want to thank Nick and Torterra. I found that video on my own on the interwebs, and I think it's a good summary of how it works, and it actually shows the work that's been done north of us to create a regional TDR program, which is something I think we can keep in the back of our minds as we move along today. And I'm going to ask both Nick and Michael to talk about this more in detail and answer some questions from you in a little bit. But first, I wanted to make sure, somebody said they couldn't hear very well. Is everyone able to hear now? Me? I'm sorry if that volume was a little low. I tried my best. Oh, wait, Stephen and Josh have their hands raised. So Josh.
It might be helpful for Steve Chamberlain if you go on mute. I think we're getting some feedback from your phone.
Thanks for that, Josh. Yeah, if everyone could stay on mute when they're not talking, that's awesome. And then Stephen Bramwell, did you have your hand raised?
I meant to just give it thumbs up.
Oh, thumbs up. Awesome. Yeah, use those reaction tools too. Those are encouraged. Okay, so what I'm going to do really quickly is, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to share my screen again because I wanted to ground us in the Thurston County program quickly. So we just saw a video about kind of how it's working in a major urban and a regional setting. And there are other videos and information online about where it's worked. I think one of the original places was Montgomery County, Maryland, which has had a lot of success with TDR. But I want to bring us back to sort of a reality check about what's been going on in Thurston County. And so I'm going to share my screen again real quick. This is not a long slideshow. So can folks see the green thing? Okay. So, you know, our TDR program again started 1995 was when our ordinances were adopted, and there were some amendments, I believe, made in 1997. So it's been on the books for quite a while. And again, it has the same goals as all TDR programs do everywhere: preserve farmland, as some places have farm and forest land and other open spaces. Thurston County's focuses on farmland and enable those owners to get economic development, economic return from selling their development rights. And then the county acts to certify those rights, and then those rights can be bought and applied in our urban areas, just like the video explained. And so the key terms here are the sending area. The rights come from land that's in our land zoned for long-term agriculture. And that's about 14,000 acres in Thurston County. And then the receiving areas where the rights may be applied in Thurston County are within the cities and urban growth areas of Lacey, Olympia, Tumwater, as well as in the Grand Mound urban growth area. So that's kind of the setup of the basic setup of our program. And just visually, you can see highlighted in green on this map, all of the sending areas, and then the different colors are showing you the receiving areas and the different zoning districts in which transferred development rights may be applied. The process is pretty, why isn't this advanced? Let's see. Good moment. The process is fairly straightforward. Folks can apply to have their development rights from their properties certified by staff, and we have all the paperwork you need to do that. It's a private buyer-seller relationship, so developers can contact the county for a list of folks who have certified their development rights and have them available for sale, and we can provide them that information. And after that, it's up to the buyer to work with the seller on a deal on those rights. It's important to know that landowners, as a sender of rights, you can retain some rights for future use. So the example given here is if you have 5 available development rights, you can choose to keep 1 back and send 4 away. So again, the cost is negotiated between the buyers and sellers, and certificates are issued, which apply to different units of density. So, there's paperwork involved. It's a fairly straightforward process. I think, Liv is here. She's actually gone through it from the buying of rights and applying them side, and we can talk with her a little bit later on. But with all that in place to date, we've only had 44 rights that have been certified through our program out of all of those thousands of acres, and hundreds of rights that could be certified. And only 4 of those rights have actually been applied to projects in receiving areas in the cities. The program really had no action for many years. In this last year, interestingly, we had our participant in the program who had 9 of their development rights certified. We also have had a transaction where 1 older right was sold to a new owner. And I think, Steve Chamberlain's on the line. I think he holds some development rights, but has not yet applied them to a project. So I'm going to stop sharing. Are there any questions, just basic questions about how the Thurston County program works? And I'll do my best to answer. And then we have Andy DeFovis, who's a staff member who helps administer the program, before we turn it to Nick and Michael for how it works elsewhere. So Betsy has raised your hand. Go ahead, Betsy.
Maybe I missed it. How is it determined how many rights one has? Is it per acre or per number of acres?
Yeah, so it is determined. It's written in code. Andy, if you have this on the top of your head, you can feel free to chime in, because I always forget the math on this.
Sure. Generally speaking, it is 1 development right per 5 acres of land. So if you had a 20-acre parcel, you would have up to 4 rights. And then there is the ability to, if you had 23 acres or 22 and a half, you could get an additional right. If you have 2.5 acres, that bumps it up to 1 more.
Okay, and then the second part of my question, in the data you showed a minute ago, you showed some number were certified, but that means that they're ready to be sold, but they haven't actually been sold. That doesn't mean they've been sold. They may have been, or they may not. Correct?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have a basic question about the program? Not saying your question will be basic, but. And then Laura, I see Laura Hodgson has joined us. Do you want to quickly introduce yourself? I think we missed you on the introductions.
Well, sorry, my name is Laura Hodgson. I am a planner with Commerce, and I come from Montgomery County, Maryland. So I'm curious about how the TDR program works here versus what we have in Montgomery County. Not that I'm very familiar with the Montgomery County model, so please don't. I don't think I could ask questions, but I could probably direct you to someone. So, thank you.
Thank you. And then I want to give Lynn Fitzhugh an opportunity to introduce yourself.
I'm Lynn Fitzhugh from Thurston Climate Action Team, and I'm just really interested to learn more about this.
Awesome. All right. And then I think Councilmember Madrone, you had your hand raised, and then we'll get to you, Sierra, after that.
Sure. And you could also just call me Danny if you like. I have a question in terms of the development rights that are available that have been certified. Is there anything that happens at Thurston County that kind of prioritizes which ones are most urgent in terms of threat of conversion?
Not that I am aware of, no. They're sort of all available all at the same time. And it's up to, we provide the contact list to any inquiring developers and they can reach out. And that's the transaction. It's an interesting question though. And then Sierra?
We saw in the video how the TDR, how the rights were being applied in Seattle to make skyscrapers taller, which seems relatively innocuous. I'm wondering how they're applied generally in Thurston County.
Right. So on the sending area side, and all of the city planners here, please help me out. But the codes are written so that in most cases in our urban areas, in those zoning districts where you have, I'll just use 5 to 12 units per acre, make that up, to achieve that last unit per acre, to get to that highest density possible, 12 units per acre, you must use development rights from the TDR program to achieve that. So that's sort of the incentive to buy a development right if you want that additional density in your project. There's a unique zoning district in Olympia where it's a 4 to 8 unit per acre zoning district. And actually to get to the lowest unit as well of density, 4 units per acre, correct me if I'm wrong, Leonard, you have to apply a development right in that case. So it was sort of an interesting way to incentivize, I think, at a time where folks were seeking sometimes the lower end of the density spectrum in some neighborhoods. We wanted them to be able to basically pay for that by helping to protect farmland out in Thurston County. So Leonard, I'll call on you next.
Yeah, I wanted to point out, Jennifer had correctly described how our program has been right up until recently. Very recently, the council adopted an ordinance to change how we apply that in the receiving areas in Olympia. So rather than within a 4 to 8 zoning district, for example, having to buy a TDR for either the lowest end, 4 units per acre, or the highest end, 8 units per acre, now it actually adds a unit, so a bonus density. So you could go up to 9 units an acre within that zoning district if you purchase a development right for that 9th unit. So that's just literally in the last month. And we have obviously not had anybody apply it there yet, but I want to make sure everybody's aware of that change and that we're hopeful that that might be attracting a little bit more usage of TDRs in Olympia.
Oh, that's awesome, Leonard. Yeah, I didn't know that. So that's great. I would love to see a copy of the ordinance if you could send one over.
Absolutely.
And then we'll play catch up with that as we do when we update our urban growth area codes for Olympia. We'll have that opportunity. So Brad, you had your hand raised too.
I just wanted to echo that that's actually for the currently our code is written that we get you're allowed at 1 additional density unit per acre for all of our residential zones through the TDR program as written now. We're also really interested in expanding the use of TDRs potentially for things like buying permanently affordable housing as another mechanism, as well as things we can do with our habitat conservation plan. So it's definitely on our agenda to look at more options than what we currently use it for.
That's great. Thank you for that. I did want to take a minute before we turn it over to Michael and Nick to talk about how it works in Central Puget Sound. We did have an attachment to your agenda that I gathered some perspectives from the community who are interested in TDR, who have used TDR, who could use TDR. And the things that jumped out at me, I hope you had a chance to read through those. I think it's useful. There's still interest in this program from our community, it appears. There are concerns about the costs involved in the program, costs of credits, return for the farmer, costs on both sides, basically. There's a concern with a lack of demand in receiving areas and maybe how we've drawn our receiving areas. Have we drawn them too narrow? Do we need to have more? And it sounds like both Brad and Leonard are and their jurisdictions have been thinking about that and how we might tweak that. But I just wanted to point out there are both obstacles in there and opportunities in there that we can be thinking about when we shift in the second half of our meeting to a discussion around, okay, now what do we do? So I think those are important perspectives to share. And then Lynn, you had your hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm still grasping how this whole thing works, so my question may reflect not understanding it correctly. It makes sense to me how it helps preserve farmland, which, you know, is an important goal as climate change goes forward. The climate mitigation plan calls for, you know, increased urban density and especially creating walkable neighborhoods along transportation lines, etc. And so I guess I'm trying to understand if this is the method that allows developers to build up in our core, which the plan wants us to do, does it in some way actually create a barrier to them as opposed to us having ordinances that would simply allow them to build up in the urban core? So that's really a question. I don't understand it enough.
I think you do understand it, Lynn, and I think it's a really good question. And I think that's something that we're going to have to talk about as a community, and we can get into that more in the second half of the meeting. And maybe, hopefully, maybe Nick and Michael can share some perspective on that, because I think it is a question. We want urban density for climate change under the Growth Management Act. We're required to have it. We're having more and more people come to our community. We want to funnel them into our lively urban areas. And we also want to preserve that farmland. And the traditional mechanism for that is that you buy a right, you preserve farmland in order to do something more in that urban area. So is that somehow creating a disincentive, right, to go denser or go higher? That's something we can think about. And it looks like Commissioner Menzer has a similar question, and I think it's a great question. And Ty, did you want to add any more to that or save it for later?
I have so many questions that I'm just hanging back and seeing as other people ask them, and a lot of them hopefully will be answered, and I can barrage you at the end if I haven't gotten answers. But one of them was something along the lines of what Lynn was asking. I'm just confused about that piece, and if the market value of the right is dependent upon a static zoning, you know, meanwhile Olympia is changing its zoning, and so is that going to, you know, I'd be nervous to invest in a right that I don't know if it's going to have the same value in 10 years if the jurisdiction's working on new zoning policies because of all these different considerations like climate change. So it seems like that's a complicating factor.
Mm-hmm. And then I think I saw Danny had another hand raised.
Yeah, I love this conversation. One of the things I noticed for the receiving areas in Olympia is it's not the areas that we want to be super dense. So I'm curious how we get receiving areas in our dense areas, in areas where we want more density. In our housing action plan, we talked about potentially having neighborhood centers as TDRs, but I also just think transit corridors in general. And I think designing a program that stays aligned with market considerations is going to have to be really important, because when you rezone things to allow more density, you do create value. And so using that value to create protections in rural areas is a good thing, but you don't want it to be so much that you disincentivize the thing that you're trying to achieve. So love the conversation.
Yeah, and I see Leonard's hand raised.
Well, yeah, I know you probably don't want to have a lengthy discussion here, and I'm sure that Nick and Michael will address this line of thinking. But just as kind of a basic concept, and I happened to be working at the city of Tumwater back in 1995 when this whole program was established, and it was a very different time then. The market was much more at the very low end of the density scale, which is why we at the time in Olympia had made that a requirement to get a development right to get down to 4 units an acre, because that's really where the market was. There was very little pressure to build at 8 units an acre at that time. So things have changed, obviously, And in the meantime, all three cities have, I think everyone here probably knows, raised zoning density allowances along those transit corridors and in our core areas significantly, so that density is really allowed by right in those areas where we want density. To get to the question asked earlier, where the receiving areas are currently set is still those sort of lower density zones where we're trying to encourage or incentivize more density, which is the thought process behind our recent zoning change to add that bonus up to a 9th unit in a 4 to 8 zone, to try to encourage a little more density in our low density areas, because it's allowed outright at quite high densities already in the corridors and the high density neighborhoods like our downtown.
Thanks, Leonard. All right, if there, and I know lots of people have lots of questions, and I promise you we'll have a lot of good discussion, more good discussion after our break. But and then if you're not muted, if you could mute, I'm hearing interesting background noises from some folks. So I am going to jump over to Michael Murphy and Nick, who are going to talk about what we saw in the video basically and how it's all working. And maybe if you could answer some of these questions the best of your ability about the market and how do we really, where do we need to turn those dials to make this work effectively, and where has it worked for you? So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think I'm up first in our speaking order. I'd like to give maybe just a little broader context about TDR generally speaking, and then maybe even before that, just speak a little bit about who Torterra is and what our background is and why are we even here. There are a few familiar faces on this call that I've worked with in the TDR realm over the years, but Torterra doesn't have a big presence in Thurston County, so maybe a little background on what we've done up a little further north would be helpful. If I can share my screen, I will do that. Show a couple slides here. All right, can everybody see this okay?
Yep.
Great. All right, so just a little context. Torterra is a regional sustainability organization. We work mainly in Pierce, King, Snohomish counties, also on the peninsula in the Chehalis watershed, and also a little bit in central Washington. And in 2007, that's really when we started working in the TDR realm, because in our earlier years as a land trust, we came to understand that the traditional tools for protecting land that a land trust used, federal funding sources, state grants, and so on, there just wasn't enough money there to achieve the scale of conservation that we envisioned for our mission. So we realized that in order to accelerate the pace of conservation and create the kinds of communities that would be really welcoming and walkable and affordable, we needed to really add the private market into the picture. So TDR was an obvious choice for achieving that, and we certainly weren't the first people to think of this. There were several pioneers in this field prior to us, both within the state and nationally, but this became one of the central strategies of our organization. So since 2007, we've really invested a lot of resources and energy into it. So we've been involved in either the creation or revisions to 17 programs, and this includes cities and counties and even at the regional scale. And one of these regional programs is the first and only voluntary regional program in the United States, which has some innovative features we can get into later that may be applicable to Thurston County. We've also been really proactive in bringing in financial resources for the use of the program. We brought in some money through state and federal funding over the years to help local governments design their programs and also to kickstart some marketplace activity. At the state level, we've been involved in passing 2 state laws and designing them. I'd also like to point out that Leonard Bauer was one of the members of our policy advisory group during his time at Commerce in the Growth Management Division. So good to see you again, Leonard. And then more recently, we've kind of expanded our role from being a program architect to being a program user. And we've become a player in the marketplace. So we actively buy and sell development rights within the areas that we work, using funds that we have from the private sector. So we've been able to be a small player in the regional TDR marketplace. Saying we're the second biggest bank doesn't really say a lot, because the first biggest bank is also the biggest TDR program in the country, which is King County's. And they're at least an order of magnitude greater than the work that we've done in this area. So that's just a little bit about kind of how our journey in becoming involved in TDR over the years. And then just to let you know where some of these communities are that we've worked. These are the cities and the counties and the regional programs where we've had some role. In some cases, we've led the design, and others we've supported it, sort of a continuum of participation there. But this is just to give you a sense of the scale at which we've been involved. Everything from, the city of Snohomish, which had about 9,000 people at the time, all the way to the regional scale, which covers probably 1.8 million residents. So from the lessons we've learned over the years, I just wanted to highlight a few common ingredients that we've discovered tend to support a healthy and vibrant marketplace for using this tool. So first of all, when we approach TDR program design, the very first thing we think about is stakeholder engagement. Who are going to be the people using the program? Who are the landowners? Who are the developers? And who are the administrators? The local government role is a really important one in making TDR successful. So we always base our analysis and our recommendations on what we hear from the community. I think it's really important for community input and sort of our general philosophy on planning in general is that people are more inclined to buy into a vision of the future if they can see themselves in it, and they're more inclined to see themselves in it if they have a chance to shape it. So for instance, when we did our updates to the Snohomish County TDR program, we interviewed over 100 individuals and groups and tribes and developers and stakeholders throughout the county. So that program is really deeply rooted in stakeholder engagement. So that's one thing that we think is really important to program success. Secondly is having a good supply. We've learned from a couple examples of our work where supply was just constrained. There wasn't enough geographical area. There weren't enough individual landowners to really create a market for using the tool. So one thing that we think is pretty essential is you need an adequate supply of sending areas, just so that because not everybody is going to want to participate. It's a voluntary tool, and the larger the range of landowners you have participating, the more likely you're going to get some who of that eligible group who want to use the program, because it's not for everybody. On the other side of that equation, you really need demand, and this has been a theme that I've heard in a lot of the questions and discussions so far in this meeting, and I think it's spot on. And this is really one of the stumbling blocks that I think holds up a lot of TDR programs that we've seen, is that the really important point is that TDR needs to be connected to growth. You don't just need to have growth, but your policies and your regulations really need to closely tie the use of TDR to that growth. So I think it was Councilmember Madrone who observed that the places where Olympia really wants to encourage higher density growth aren't actually the receiving areas. So that might be an example of an area where connecting demand to TDR could help spur use of the tool. Economics is a huge question as well. This is maybe close second or tie for first with the most common obstacle to TDR success. It's hard to calibrate the mechanics of a TDR program so that landowners make money to the point that they're encouraged to participate, and that developers make money to the point that they're encouraged to participate. And that's also a kind of a moving target. Real estate dynamics change, the market changes, demographics change, and so over time, the economic factors that influence your program use will shift. So it's important to keep your program current and tuned into what the market dynamics are doing, and also designing it in a way that everybody feels like they're getting a fair deal. After that, I'd say an administrative model is a pretty important component as well. This is an area that can make a really big difference in the usability of the tool. So when I say administrative model, that basically means how does the program work? Who is operating it? How easy is it to use? What are the steps that landowners and developers have to take in order to use the program? That this can cover a really wide range of levels of involvement. So on one end, I'll use Snohomish County as an example. They have kind of a laissez-faire approach to their program where it's in place, they've got good informational resources, but there isn't like a really hands-on proactive effort to recruit participation and encourage the use of the tool. Landowners and developers can find each other, they can make transactions, and it's been successful to some extent in Snohomish County in that model. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you can have a really highly engaged operational approach. And Murph can speak more to that. I think King County is a great example where that government has invested a lot of resources to engage users and recruit participation and make it really easy and attractive for landowners and developers to use the tool. So kind of the mechanics, how people get involved, how they learn about it, how easy it is to get their credit certified. That's all part of the administrative model. And then finally, this is a little less tangible, but no less essential to program success, is you need political will to make it work. And this is where the hard or more challenging decisions are made, where you need to align the policy and the regulation with growth. So this is kind of relates to the comments I made about demand. TDR needs to be connected with growth. And the way you do that is by adopting land use policy and development regulations that connect future land uses and the desired growth patterns with the use of TDR, so that you're really tuned into the demand of the market, and that you're really creating a functional marketplace. So there are certainly other factors as well. These are kind of the main ones that I want to highlight, and I guess I'll just wrap up my comments there because Mark needs some time to speak as well. But I'll just stop sharing my screen here, and I imagine there may be one or two questions. And Jennifer, please stop me if we have timing considerations.
I think we're good so far. I'd love to turn it over to Murph, as we call him, to maybe do his part of the presentation, and then have questions for both of you from the group, if that sounds okay.
Sounds good to me. Hello all. I'm gonna share my screen as well. I've got some slides. I will talk about King County's program and some of the drivers for success that sort of has made the program work. So let me go here, and are you all seeing my screen? All right, yep. Seeing it not. So there's me. Let's see. All right, good. So the King County's program is basically set up by, to sort of cross lines that are set with the Growth Management Act. We've got generally speaking, the western third of King County is our urban growth area, with the exception of Vashon Island out in Puget Sound there. And the eastern 2/3 of the county are rural zones or resource zones. So we've got a lot of forest production district in King County and a lot of agricultural production districts. Our ag and forest zoning are big blocks of zones. And it's not evident here, but the easternmost third of the county is generally forest production district. And then sort of the central third is a mix of rural residential and agricultural zoning. And then again, the western third being the urban residential or the urban areas. So in King County, nearly all of the rural zones and resource zones are eligible sending areas that can be permanently protected through the TDR tool. So we've got a vast array of sending sites available to enroll in the program. And like other TDR programs, it's voluntary on both sides, on sending and receiving sites, but there are a whole lot of sending sites eligible in King County. And we've also, through what's called our Land Conservation Initiative, identified more than 60,000 acres that we'd like to see permanently protected for conservation purposes, in addition to what's already protected. So on the receiving side of things, this map is a little bit misleading. The by right receiving areas are unincorporated urban areas of King County. That's shown in yellow on this map. Relatively few of those are left because of annexations across the county. Within the cities, and this is the misleading part, not all of Seattle or all of Bellevue are receiving areas. It's really focused within the cities with whom we have agreements in urban centers where, so in Seattle, for instance, it's downtown Denny Triangle and South Lake Union. Bellevue, it was the Bell Red Corridor. In Issaquah, it's the Central Business District. So it's not all of the cities that are shown here, but downtown cores within. So there are two ways that the county's program works. And I think having both of these tools or both of these sort of program methodologies has been important to our success. The private program is very similar to how it sounds like it works in Thurston County. This is where a private landowner of their own accord, voluntarily chooses to grant a conservation easement to the county, and the county certifies the transferable development rights and puts those in the landowner's name, and then the landowner can sell those development rights to an eligible developer, and the landowner gets the money for the. They don't get paid for the conservation easement up front, but they get compensation later down the road when they sell those development rights, transferable development rights, to a developer. Typically in King County's model, the private program applies to smaller, often single family properties. It generally isn't driven by the value proposition as much as it is by the sort of desire to leave a legacy of permanent conservation, land protection. In some cases, the money is what does it for the landowners, but it's often somebody living on, say, a 20-acre lot with 5-acre zoning. They've got one home. They want to leave the surrounding forest, on their lot as forest forever and ensure that it's going to stay that way. So whereas they might get, say, $75,000 from the 3 TDRs they create, that's not as much of a motivator as that long-term permanent conservation in the private program most of the time. Not always that way, but so we have a private program in King County. We also have a TDR Bank, and this is a model where King County is a primary actor in the system. So whereas in the private program, a landowner would donate with no compensation a conservation easement to King County, in the bank model, King County is actually purchasing that conservation easement at fair market value. And that's a really important distinction. We figure out what to pay a landowner based on a third-party appraisal that's then internally reviewed. that gauges the value of stripping the development potential. So in that same 20-acre property that had the ability to create 3 additional lots, each of those lots might be worth $250,000 in today's market, which is bonkers, by the way, up here. I expect it is down there as well. So in the TDR Bank model, it might be King County purchasing a conservation easement from that landowner for $700,000 or more. And it's often not the sort of full sale value if a property owner were to list it on the open market that might, that the easement might be worth, but maybe 70 to 80% of that. So King County might pay this same landowner with a 20-acre property $500,000 for that easement. And then King County takes the TDRs that result and puts them in its bank and uses those to facilitate deals with cities with whom we have agreement, like Seattle, Bellevue, Issaquah, and Sammamish. So King County is a primary actor, and in this model, there is additional sort of value for the rural landowner that can happen. So, and then of course, when we get proceeds from the sale of those development rights, we use them to acquire more conservation easements, and it's a revolving fund of sorts. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that revolving fund nature right now. So King County uses conservation futures tax revenues to protect land. And I believe Thurston County does as well. I'm not sure the scale at which you use that. I'm seeing you nod, Jennifer. That's good. So we often use TDR Bank money, the money that results from the sale of TDRs that the King County Bank sells, to match our CFT. And in some cases, conservation futures money alone, matched with, say, King County Parks levy funding, will permanently protect a property, or buy it outright in fee. And the King County TDR Bank will take those TDRs. So in effect, we're using CFT and the Parks levy to subsidize the TDR Bank in getting more TDRs. And that might seem like it's antithetical to the conservation purposes, but the CFT committee that we have that guides a lot of our decisions with respect to how we use CFT money actually likes it because it's a way to recoup some of the expenditure, and it further leverages CFT money and Parks levy. So it creates a revolving fund of sorts and allows us to stretch our money further. And again, I realize this is complicated and there's a lot going on here, but we'll have time for questions. So this is a snip from a website that we host on the county's web pages, kingcounty.gov/TDR. There's something called the property map there. It shows the sending sites that we've got, and this is interactive, so you can click on any one of the dots or any one of the polygons. The green dots and green polygons on this map are areas that have created TDRs when they were protected. 116 sending sites, 80 of those are through the bank, 36 through the private model. We've protected almost 145,000 acres of land countywide. 2 big chunks in forest zones. The one down here in South County was a private enrollment that Plum Creek Timber did at the time. Weyerhaeuser now owns those TDRs. And the one up here is the Snoqualmie Forest, and that was a TDR Bank one. So a lot of land protected. We've also put that on the ground, or either King County or private owners have put that on the ground in 112 receiving sites. And the numbers are here. So a lot of use of the program in King County. So Nick and I often cover very similar ground. I've got this list of what it takes to for a TDR program to be successful. Like Nick said, you got to have supply, and that's sort of the will of the government to create zoning and to create a program, and also to identify conservation priorities, right? What is it that we want to protect? That creates the supply. there's got to be demand. You've got to have receiving areas, and it's got to be worth it for the developers to participate, right? And then right economics. The prices paid to rural landowners need to be high enough to incentivize them to participate. In some cases, that sort of ethic of conservation is enough, but not in all cases. And then the developers have to get enough to benefit of using the TDRs to make it worth their while. And I'm gonna stay here for a little bit and talk a little bit about, and forgive me, I'm gonna sort of take a step deeper into the weeds here, but part of this getting the economics right is also getting the transfer ratios right. And when I say transfer ratios, what I mean by that is how many development rights are you taking off of a sending site, and how many is that turning into for a developer? In King County, most of our agricultural zones are actually 35 acre zoning, where you could have one home per 35 acres. Yet, if we enroll a 35 acre vacant piece of farmland that's zoned agriculture or agricultural into the TDR program, that actually will generate 7 TDRs, 1 per 5 acres. This was a policy choice the county made a long time ago, and it's written into our codes, where every vacant 5 acres of farmland in the agricultural zones can create 1 TDR. So because we wanted to incentivize the protection of farmland through our program. And that 1 TDR that comes off of each 5 acres of farmland is just as valuable to a developer as 1 TDR that comes off a 5 acre zoned piece of rural land that, where you protected 5 acres of a RA5 zone, for instance. So through those ratios, we have kind of incentivized participation in the program. We have bonus TDRs that can come off of land that is adjacent to waters of the state that are designated under our Shoreline Master Program as conservancies. So we've taken policy steps at the county to kind of boost the benefit to the rural landowner side. And then we have also some policies on the receiving site side that give varying amounts of bonus to developers who avail themselves of the program. So the point here on the right economics is that it isn't always just a 1-for-1 in King County. In some cases, we've adjusted ratios to make it a sweeter deal on both sides of the equation, and that's helped us, I think, be successful through the years in uptake of the program. And then the final point I'll make is the need for simplicity. Nick hit it as well. If it's too complicated for either the sending site landowners or the developers using the program, if they have to take too much time and money and lawyers and so forth to use it, it really deflates, takes a lot of the air out of the balloon of TDR. So in King County's case, and Nick alluded to this, we are fortunate to have the resources for me to spend much of my time working on TDR. And I also have parts of 2 different positions that support the program. And we've got lawyers and management and our permitting division, all of whom help support the program in various ways. So we're fortunate to have capacity, but we run the TDR Bank entirely and do a lot of handholding and facilitating through the private program, to the point where I kind of describe it as us almost performing as escrow agents for private enrollments and private sales to developers. We do a lot of facilitation. If you dig into our website, you'll see we've actually got an online listing of all the private TDRs that are available, or many of them, kind of like a little Craigslist for TDRs. So we've put a lot of time and energy into facilitating the program in the sort of the overall goal of keeping it simple enough for both landowners on the sending site side and developers on the receiving site side to use. Final thing I'll say is that really important for the King County TDR Bank success has been agreements with cities. And some of this is wrapped up in some legislation that I don't think we'll get into today, called the Landscape Conservation and Local Infrastructure Program. But in having agreements with cities is really what drives demand. Without that, then you can have all the supply you want, but the program still might not work. And one of the key components of attracting cities is making it a sweet enough deal for not just the developers in the cities, but also the communities in the receiving areas where the cities work. And one of the ways we do that in King County is provide additional incentives to cities in the way of what we call amenity fund. Sometimes that takes the form of essentially a signing bonus. When a city signs on, we dish the city several $100,000 in most cases. Sometimes we do a revenue share when the county sells TDRs to a city, to a developer within a city. We share a portion of the revenue that we get back to the city for use in infrastructure and amenities in the receiving areas. And then a third model, which we have in place with Seattle, is actually sharing a portion of the county's property tax revenues to the city, again, for infrastructure uses in the receiving area. So I know I covered a lot there. That's all I've got in the way of slides. And there's the stop share button. I will leave it there, and I hope we have time for questions that either Nick and I, again, we've done this tag team so many times in so many different venues that either of us can answer the question, and Nick will just work it out who takes what. So thanks much for listening.
That was so helpful and informative, and I'm taking mad notes. So let's open it up for questions. We're going to do questions and answers until we'll hit a break time around 10:30 and give us all a little break and then come back for additional discussion. But I see Lynn's hand raised. So go ahead, Lynn.
Yeah. So the average farmer in America is 61 years old. So we're about to face a crisis of many farmers wanting to retire and their farmland being too expensive for a beginning farmer to buy. So as I was understanding, Michael, what you were describing about the two different kinds of TDRs, it struck me, and again, I may not be understanding this correctly, that a farmer who was wanting to retire and stay on their land would, like selling the $500,000 version that you were talking about. And I would assume would live on the land not farming. And since I think one of the goals here is to try to keep our farms producing, so is this scenario I'm imagining possible where it results in the farm's length fallow?
It is, and what you're driving at is something that we have batted around in the policy discussions at the county for a while, which is kind of affirmative easements that not only protect the ground to preserve the potential to farm, but actually require the farm to stay in production. We haven't gone there. We've done a couple appraisals that would sort of gauge what that would mean, and we would pay more for that because it puts an obligation on the landowner to continue farming or lease their property to farm. One of the reasons we haven't gone there yet, and I do say yet, honestly, because we have our agricultural policy folks in the county would very much like to see what you're talking about. We haven't gone there yet for a couple reasons. One is the challenge of enforcement, and that's that in that scenario where we've got an aging farmer who's no longer able to farm, who wishes they could, but they can't because now they're 88 years old and they just can't pull it off anymore. Is the county going to go out there and penalize them for being too old to farm? We haven't solved how to handle that one yet, right? And I think part of it is in farm link programs and sort of farm incubator programs and so forth. There may be some answers in there, but that's that's been one of the key challenges that we've faced. A much distant sort of second reason that we haven't gone there is because it costs more money and it's more complicated. The language is tough. We did look into some, I forget which state it was, somewhere in the Northeast, it may have been Vermont, where there were some programs that actually had those affirmative easements in place. We like the idea. We haven't figured out how to make it work in King County.
I guess a quick follow-up on that would be, how does it normally work if they've bought this TDR and then they do decide that they want to sell their property? Does the easement just go with the I don't know.
The easement runs with the land. It is a decision that today's landowner is making for the perpetuity with respect to how that land can be used.
But it doesn't prevent them from selling their land.
It does not, no.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Leonard.
Thanks, both Nick and Michael, and probably either or both of you could answer this, but I'm really interested from the receiving area side in the programs you both work with. Are there specific ways the receiving areas are set up that are greater incentives for TDRs to be applied or for developers to purchase those TDRs? What are the characteristics of those areas that seem to be the most popular receiving areas?
You want to take it, Nick?
Murph, do you mind if I take a swing at this?
Please.
Fill in any gaps that I may miss. So Torterra has been looking at increasingly creative ways to apply TDR because we understand that it's not a one-size-fits-all tool. And in some communities, the incentive that developers are looking for is additional density, be that building height, floor area ratio, additional dwelling units. But that's not always what everybody wants everywhere. So that's part of our, through our stakeholder engagement and economic analysis work, we endeavor to identify what are the incentives that the market wants. And in some places, those aren't additional density. For like in places like in, I'll use Shoreline, for example, right now, it is going to have 2 light rail stations, and they rezoned the areas around those light rail stations and are looking at turning those into TDR receiving areas. So what they already have pretty generous zoning and density limits in those neighborhoods. But what developers would like in some cases is to build less structured parking, because that's really expensive. So TDR can create value for a developer, not only through additional product to sell in an additive way, but also through cost savings. So if I'm just going to make up some numbers, but I think a structured parking stall costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $60,000. And if as a developer, you can buy a TDR credit for $30,000 and not build one structured parking unit, then you're saving $30,000, which adds that value to your project just as it would if you were selling an additional unit for an extra $30,000. And there are other design elements. You can get flexibility in setbacks and design guidelines. I mean, one of the beauties of TDR is that it's so flexible, is that you can convert a development right from a rural property into almost any commodity in an urban area that a developer wants to pay for that they can't get now. So really the key is that to make it work, it needs to be affordable to a developer. It needs to have a meaningful value proposition, so they're making money using the tool. And it should be something additive in the sense that you're offering an incentive to do something that is not currently possible. So like what I don't recommend doing is, down zoning and then saying, okay, you've got to buy back whatever additional density that you would have otherwise gotten by right. So it needs to be above and beyond what's already possible. And it can be really flexible in terms of what the market is interested in providing. So That's just one example of kind of thinking creatively of what kinds of incentives you can offer. And then the other half of that is that they need to be priced appropriately so that a developer can go out and purchase development rights, and it's a profitable use of the tool. And that's what Murph was talking about in these transfer ratios. You know, if you buy one development right, what does that get you? And is that return, sufficient motivation to use the tool?
That's a fantastic answer, Nick. And I'm going to add on something that doesn't answer your question directly, but I think it's relevant. And it speaks to a point that's sort of was made earlier about urban receiving areas basically giving away the density instead of creating a structure that requires TDRs to get to the max density. And the note I jotted for myself there is that it's really a both and kind of equation, right? You need to have elected officials, planning departments, and communities who recognize that, yes, we want urban density, and we need to protect the rural and resource and environmental areas for everybody's well-being, right? So it's all of the things Nick said, which is the direct answer to your question, and it's the sort of political will, political will meaning sort of writ large there from all those levels to do this because of the environmental benefits, and it's climate change mitigation and adaptation, it's ecological, it's salmon, it's orcas, it's all that that results from the permanent protection of the array of sending sites, at least that we have in King County, right? It's maybe a slightly different thing if it's only ag in the sending sites, but TDR sending sites can also be all of that other stuff that's important to protect for ecological and sort of human well-being. So.
All right, Allison has a question.
It's a question for Murph, but maybe Nick as well. It sounded like in your description, one of the reasons the King County program is so successful is that you have a robust staff, constant administration. And it strikes me that Thurston County's program was really designed to be administratively light on the county. It's really meant to be a private individual to individual with very limited county interaction. But that means there isn't somebody there that's funded to continue promoting the program. So I'm curious about how that funding model is set up. For King County, is it a part of the TDR fee? Like what funds the active management of the program?
It's a great question, and Nick, I'll kick to you when I'm done to speak to other jurisdictions how they handle it. But there are a couple things with King County. I feel extraordinarily fortunate, and I'm cognizant that we have revenues coming from property taxes, surface water management fees, and really the overhead of my salary is supported by our surface water management fee. That's the division that I'm in that collects and uses that. But then it's program revenues from TDR Bank sales that funds the other part, the majority of my salary. So our code sets up a system whereby we can use revenues from sales to keep the program alive and to do the sort of facilitation of that. And I'd be remiss if I didn't also give a nod to CFT, because as I said when I was talking, that CFT heavily, and Parks Levy too, heavily subsidizes the purchase of transferable development rights or the purchase of properties that yield TDRs. And then when I sell them, that money, and I'm sort of reluctant to often use these terms in a public venue like this, but that money's sort of cleaned, right? And I get to then use it to support the program going forward. We use the vast majority, I'd say over 85 to 90% of our revenues toward additional new easements, but we do have a policy where we hold back for administrative support purposes up to 15% of the revenues that we receive to keep the program alive so that we can keep it simple enough to use on both sides of the equation. So hopefully, Allison, that answers your question.
Yeah, maybe on the other end of the spectrum, Snohomish County is a good example where they have the desire to have a really effective conservation outcome through using TDR, but they also want to take a really light touch, and they don't have the same resources and capacity to invest in the program that King County does by contrast. So in Snohomish County, the role of TDR program administrator is one fraction of one FTE in the planning department. And TDR being a market-based program, we really try to encourage as much market involvement, private sector involvement in the market as possible. But the reality is that there are certain functions that local government is always going to have to play. And at minimum, these are going to include TDR certification, issuing certificates, recording easements and deed restrictions, and then also tracking the use of TDR in the receiving area so that they're extinguished. So there's always going to be some kind of administrative role that local governments will play as part of their function. But I think it's possible to design TDR mechanics in a way that creates a lot of resources for the private market to get information and find each other and connect to really allow local governments who want that light touch to still get the conservation benefit of the tool and the growth management benefit of the tool without having to be, driving the bus with their foot on the gas and having a really active role. So you can have whatever investment on that continuum that you want that meets your needs and matches your resources. But I think it's possible to have a successful program either way. And I think at a certain point, if the volume of activity is so big that the private market sort of runs out of capacity for effectively creating transactions, then a bank becomes really helpful. So for example, in that what skyscraper we saw in the video, that developer had to buy 14,000 acres worth of credits. How many landowners is it going to take to piece together that many credits? I mean, if you've got a huge, commercial timberland sending area, then you can probably do it. But if you're talking about individual farms, that's an enormously complex transaction. And a bank can be an intermediary that allows, that can handle that kind of volume. So I think in the early stages of programs, banks may not be an essential ingredient, but I think as the market evolves and you see the kind of volume where a bank can be helpful, then it's a really valuable component.
Thanks, Nick. Ryan has his hand raised.
Yeah, I'm curious on the receiving area kind of / development side of things. What role does lending institutions like real banks, not just TDR banks, but like money banks, play in this? Are they comfortable in lending people money that are going to be spending that on development rights? Are they familiar with these types of concepts? Or is that something that is paid out of like capital from a developer? I don't know if you guys have experience in that, know kind of behind the scenes what happens when it comes to that, but I'm just curious if banks will actually lend on development rights, because it seems like, especially in the King County area, that's a significant amount of money, and just curious how that might work.
I'll speak to it, but I don't, Nick, maybe you have more. I don't have a really good view behind the curtain. Most of the interactions I have with the tower developers, for instance, in downtown Seattle, Denny Triangle, South Lake Union, are via land use attorneys. And I'm near certain I can say this and it's accurate, that what they pay for the TDRs, even to get that 14,000 acres worth of protection and 12 stories in Rainier Tower, is just a tiny percentage of the overall cost to develop a tower like that in downtown Seattle. So it's I forget our largest deal ever, but it's in the $5 to $6 million range. and building a tower like that is 200 to 300 million, probably minimum, right? So a long way of saying, I don't think that well, and then one other point is that the use of TDR to get bonus density in downtown Seattle, for instance, is very clear when it will and when it won't work. And the land use attorneys that I talk with, representing the developers, they know exactly when it will or won't work and are very clear about that going in. That's what lenders and banks and capital investors are often looking for, is as much certainty as possible. And when it comes to using TDR in Seattle, it's black and white. I can't think, I'll knock on wood here, I can't think of a time when it was disputed, because the lawyers figure that out ahead of time and then avoid. So anything to add, Nick?
Yeah, I think your point about the scale of TDR costs in the overall project budget is really important. I think the same relationship holds true at a smaller scale. In my conversations with developers in Snohomish County, their approach has always been, TDR is another cost that's just a line item in their pro forma for a project, because they have to pay for land and permitting and entitlement, and there's a whole list of expenses that goes into a development project. TDR is just one more thing in there. One idea that we've explored is if you kind of change the economics of the development relating to TDR in terms of when you require the developer to provide the TDR credits in the development process. So it's a pretty common point in the process to require TDR certificates in order to receive the building permit. Seattle times it a little differently. They require proof of purchase in order to get certificate of occupancy. So that's much later in the development process. And I think there are some advantages to that approach, because that really reduces carrying costs for developers, especially in Seattle, where the scale of some of these projects can take years to build. So if you have to purchase, $3 million worth of credits and you don't get to, realize that for another 3 years, then that's cost you're carrying. But if you have to, buy your development rights and show that you've got them right before, like when your building is done, then your carrying costs are much lower. So there are ways you can reduce that burden to developers to reduce costs.
Yeah, I'll chime in with a couple examples on the other end of the scale from the towers, like Nick was alluding to. TDRs can be used in urban unincorporated King County to get up to 150% of base density at subdivisions, right? So a subdivision that might have 12 units by base density could have 18 using TDRs. The developers in that model are paying between $20,000 and $30,000 per TDR. They're probably selling each of those lots for $400,000 to $500,000 each, and they're certainly making more profit or more additional profit than the 20 to 30 they put in. Again, that's all visible sort of in a pro forma, and a bank would look at that and say that's a good bet for us. And then to the point of timing, in that subdivision model, what the developer needs is to purchase the TDRs by the time, just before they get their final engineer stamp on the subdivision. They need to get under an agreement and prove they have access to TDRs in the time leading up to that, but they don't actually have to purchase them until they go get that engineer stamp on the new lots. So like Nick said, it's a way to reduce the carrying costs for the developer and make sure they can get through all of the other requirements for the subdivision, like turn radiuses on the driveways and open space in the subdivision and so forth. If they run into a roadblock and they can't get the total number of units they were planning on from TDR, then they don't have to buy the TDRs to get those units. So.
Okay, it's a little bit past 10:30. This has been awesome. And I know Nick and Michael aren't going anywhere, or I'm not allowing you to go anywhere. Let's take a 10-minute break. So we'll reconvene at 10:43. I know the coffee in my system tells me I need one. And we'll come back and we will continue this Q&A, and we'll also enter into sort of our roundtable discussion of kind of where we're coming from and what we're thinking as a group about what we've heard today and where we want to go. So I'll see you back at 10:43. Thank you. All right, welcome back. We're going to continue with our agenda. And so the first question I really am posing pretty broadly is this tool of TDR still a priority for our region to meet our farmland conservation goals and our growth management goals? I just want to take the temperature of the group. You've heard how our program works. You've heard how it works in other places. And I'm just curious if folks are feeling that it is still something we, Thurston County, should be investing in, because it's clear to me from the discussion that there are investments that probably need to be made in order for it to work better. So I'm going to pose that question out there. I see Loretta raised her hand right away. Go for it, Loretta.
I just want to ask if the question should be slightly broader, and that is picking up on the idea that some other counties use, where it's used for not just farmland preservation, but for preservation, all the preservations that would have to do with meeting our climate mitigation goals. So land use for other purposes as well, and perhaps also for some of our shoreline protection goals. Should that be part of the conversation is my question.
I see some people nodding. Curious about if anyone else wanted to weigh in on that. You know, should we broaden our sending area beyond just our long-term ag zoned lands, and what impact might that have on how our program works? Brad, are you? Oh, I saw you come on. Do you have a hand raised?
No, I think we would be interested in exploring that for both the climate mitigation side of things, as well as our habitat conservation plan, conservation area side.
Do other people have feelings about that? And again, we're not going to answer these questions today, and we're not going to solve these problems today, but getting those questions on the table for additional exploration, I think, is key, a key result of today. So if there are other folks who have a perspective on that, broadening the sending area idea. Let's see, we have a couple people. Lynn?
I think Danny was ahead of me.
Oh, go ahead then, Danny.
Yeah, I support broadening the types of protection that we use the TDR program for, and also broadening the sending area. We've had conversations in Olympia. We have a lot of goals in our comprehensive plan around local food production, and we're looking at areas in Olympia and our UGA that we might want to protect to achieve some of those goals. And I do know that TDRs can be used in UGAs if they're, tied to local food system planning. So that's some of the conversation that we're interested in as well. And of course, our goals around density are incredibly important too. So tying that all together.
All right, and then I'll go to Lynn, and then we'll go to Ty after Lynn.
Just sort of expanding on what Loretta said, we have a lot of second growth in our county, and even in a few rare places, old growth. And it's not as protected as one might think it is. A lot of it is winding up getting torn down and developed. And in terms of climate mitigation, the biggest trees that we have, the biggest 1% and 2% trees do 50% of the sequestering. So it's really, really important that we figure out how to protect them. So if this was a way that could do that, that would be very valuable. And our mitigation plan does call for both the protection of trees and the planting of something in the order of 39,000 acres worth of trees, which the question has been really raised if we even have that acreage to plant them on. So this is important.
Thanks, Lynn. Commissioner Menzer?
I just wondered if you, Jennifer, or maybe Andy, know why we are limited to long-term ag. Was there a thinking behind that, or a good policy, or just trying to start small, or what was the rationale for limiting the sending area to that?
Well, it was definitely a local policy decision. So I think back in the 90s when this all first started, and maybe Nick has good history, or Murph, I think it was looked at primarily as a farmland preservation tool from the get-go. Those are the things I studied in grad school anyway, was that it was linked to farmland preservation. That's kind of the genesis, and has since expanded to be all sorts of conservation. And I think that, and Ryan points out in the chat, maybe to compensate for some of the downzoning that occurred with the Growth Management Act in our rural area of those agricultural lands, which have some of our lowest density zoning in our rural area, right? 1 unit per 20 acres is what our long-term ag land is. Our other ag district in Thurston County, Nisqually Ag, is 1 unit per 40, but Thurston County invested conservation futures funds to purchase development rights from most of our Nisqually ag land. So that land is sort of in that permanent farming, protected state, whereas the rest of the long-term ag land, which is the majority of our long-term ag in Thurston County, was subject to the lowest density zoning. So I think that was part of the conversation, was what can we give back to help compensate for that. I think all of that thinking has evolved over time and should evolve. And so there's nothing that's tying our hands in terms of looking at an expansion of what kinds of land would qualify for a TDR program. But obviously, the more we expand the supply, if we don't have the demand side there, that's not going to do our farmers any favors, or anyone else who's participating on the sending side. So it's a policy decision entirely that we could make.
Just one note on that is, even if we were limiting ourselves to agricultural land, my understanding, I think, I don't know if I got this from Community Farmland Trust or Agriculture Advisory Committee, but I think we have a pretty low number of acres in long-term ag zoning comparing to other counties. So farming in Thurston County isn't occurring in the same zoning schemes as other places. And so even if we were just focused on farmland, we may want to expand beyond LTA. It's just my thing.
Yeah, and that's an excellent point, Commissioner. And Thurston County is currently looking at potential expansions to our long-term agricultural zone. We're actually under an appeal from FutureWise to do that work and analysis. And that's a future policy decision in and of itself. But most of our agriculture takes place outside of our long-term ag lands, and more of it occurs on small lots and even in urban areas. And we're having lots of discussions at our Ag Advisory Committee about what do we do for those folks? What more incentives can we bring to the table to keep people in farming? So so ongoing policy work on that side of the equation as well. So I wanted to get to Sarah, who had her hand raised.
Yeah, thank you so much. The conversation about expanding to other natural resource types, is a tentative yes, right? We want to conserve all of our natural resources, but I'd be interested in knowing a couple of things. First, what natural resource types are at the highest risk of conversion? What are the highest rates of conversion? What are the hardest types to protect through other types of programs and revenue sources? There might be a lot of funding to protect certain types of habitat or certain shoreline areas, or more restrictions already in place that's protecting those areas where there may be not the level of resources protecting ag land, for example. So I'd be interested in knowing the impacts of broadening that, and if that's going to dilute some of these efforts that we're trying to further in this community, and particularly around agricultural land preservation. So pros and cons, certainly, of broadening that and the impacts to different resource types. And then I would also just echo what Commissioner Menzer said about expanding from long-term ag, because it is restrictive and doesn't incorporate all of the ag land and operations that are underway in Thurston County.
Thanks, Sarah. The next person with their hand raised is Scott.
So yeah, back to the question about should we do this? I think it's a big question for the cities because they're large receiving areas, and the county. If the cities don't want to do this, does the county want to start making more UGA receiving areas and just step in and do it on the county terms? The big thing that I know, the last time I did one of these was probably 10 years ago. And I'm going to use the example of a 4 to 8 zoning, but we had a developer or two in the room and they said, there's no point in me buying these development rights because if I'm zoned 4 to 8, because of all the other regulations, I can only build 5 or 6 units. So there's no financial incentive for me to do anything else.
Thanks, Scott. That's an excellent point that we have to get that motivation factor right. I did want to share Steve Chamberlain, who was a developer who was on the call, who had to go. I think he's gone. He did send me an email and he said, and I said I would share this during the discussion, so now might be a good time. He said, as a holder of a relatively large number of TDRs in Thurston County, my comments are simply that the entire urban growth area should be opened up to accept TDR. I have a project in the approval pipeline in Lacey's UGA. I plan and need to use TDRs there that I purchased in 2028. But I learned in 2021 I'm restricted to where I can use them. So what is the process to change that? And I think good question. I think we're in that process. So something to think about from a developer's perspective. So I'll go to Stephen, who's the next person on my list with his hand raised. Bramwell.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I work with WSU Extension and a lot of farmers. So kind of in an offhanded way, I certainly support, the priority of working on this programming and developing it. But then, with a little more thoughtfulness, I think doing it is important and should be done if it's done well. And I think that's kind of what we're hearing here is there's a lot of pieces that need to work together. So like a concern that Scott raised doesn't end up hobbling the program, that was started with good intentions. So that was my first comment. I'm starting to blank on the second one. So I'll raise my hand again.
Okay, that sounds good.
Thanks.
Danny?
Curious what kind of resources are needed to design a program that will work in Thurston County. I assume, Jennifer, you have more than this on your plate, and it sounds like there's a lot of stakeholder engagement work that's needed. So bringing on additional help and what is needed to make that happen. And maybe there's an appeal to be made to the county and the cities who are involved to help share the costs of getting that together so that we can, if it's the desire to create an effective program, getting the resources together with all of the interjurisdictional stakeholders to get it to move forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. Lots on our plate in Thurston County. Of course, we are, we're not King County. We all know that. All of our budgets are constrained. Thinking ahead, I did put in a budget request for my division this year for 2022 for some additional funding to potentially look to that kind of third-party help that you're alluding to, but it is a regional approach that's needed. So it is an interesting idea to think about how the costs for maybe bringing on a third party consultant, a facilitator of stakeholder groups, what have you. It would be an interesting thing to pursue as a region and as multiple jurisdictions together to share that cost and maybe make it a little more palatable to everyone. And we don't have to solve that today, but it's definitely something we can be thinking about and working on in our other forums with one another to discuss. So thank you for that point. And then Stephen, you
Yeah,
have your
thanks.
hand raised again.
Yeah, I remembered. Yes, some of that facilitation to get stakeholder input sounds really appealing, and that's kind of part of my first point in terms of, you know, setting up a group of incentives on the sending and receiving side that work well and that really sort of monetize and mobilize people's interest. The piece I wanted to mention was I found it also appealing to include the ag land and forest land in the King County model. So that type of expansiveness beyond agriculture that's sometimes thought of in terms of crops and livestock, the timber or non-timber forest products for the preservation of forests, I think is really appealing. And I would just be, you know, interested from folks like a, you know, facilitator with expertise in these programs elsewhere, you know, does the county need to be cautious of expanding the sending areas in certain ways that might have unforeseen impacts, or is it just well worthwhile to be really expansive and inclusive about how those sending areas are defined? So that's my comment there.
See, I knew I'd have a mute on at some point. So I have Councilmember Sullivan with your hand raised, and then Murph is after that, and maybe he has some perspective to share too.
So a thought with being new to this, you know, this may be off the cuff comment, but maybe there could be like a board or a commission that involves the jurisdictions, the county, the extension program office that might instill more ability to have these types of credits go forward, and how it could be expanded and not leave it completely to the county to do that. And maybe, you know, like an advisory board. I know that there might be a lot of individuals that might be interested from groups that would might be interested in doing something like that.
Great, thank you for that. Michael Murphy.
Yeah, just back to Stephen's point about, or the point generally about expanding, just wanted to share that for King County's sending areas, there are basically, you know, a couple simple eligibility criteria. There needs to be, the zoning needs to be right, and it's rural, residential, ag, forest. There needs to be existing development potential that's not used. And then we have a criterion that's basically, is there long-term benefit to the public of conservation of that land? And that can be very gray, but we go back to the RCW definitions that apply to current use taxation and conservation futures in 8434. They kind of very broadly define what's of interest in the state's view to protect long-term for conservation purposes. So just wanted to make that point that there are basically 3 eligibility criteria in King County: zoning and acreage and development potential, and then conservation benefit as kind of in the construct that are laid out in 8434 in the RCWs.
Thank you for that. Nick, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. On the same theme of sending area expansion generally, this may be kind of getting ahead into like the kind of conversation you would have in a program update process. But really the establishment of the sending area priorities, it's a policy decision. And that is one that's taken jointly by the county in whose jurisdiction the sending areas happen to occur. But there's also a role for the receiving area jurisdictions. So for example, you know, a receiving area may have specific priorities. It may want to reduce flooding hazards in its city. So protecting lands that you know, would reduce flood hazards would be a priority. Maybe you want to conserve lands in your food chain. So you would prioritize farms that are sources of food. Maybe it's riparian restoration, because you care about salmon and orcas and Puget Sound recovery. You can kind of, you know, fine tune what those priorities are and incorporate them into the program design. And it's fine, in fact, totally effective to have multiple priorities, and to have program mechanics that reflect that. And you can kind of pick, which of those takes precedence. You can assign different transfer ratios to different types of spending areas. If you care about one thing a little bit more than another, or you want to prioritize conservation in one area relative to another, there's a lot of flexibility and adaptability that you can incorporate into TDR program design that can really reflect those, what those priorities are. And then kind of another nuance that we really encourage local governments to think about is what the comparative pricing is of development rights in different kinds of, for different lands. So in Snohomish County, we recognize that development pressure is a lot higher on ag lands because they're flat, they're close to the city, the zoning is already pretty high. So development values there would be higher than they would be on commercial forest lands that are on steep slopes farther out away from urban communities. So you can calibrate those pricing differences into the mechanics of the program. And then you can also, take other considerations in, like, what are you trying to protect? Is it those lands at highest risk of conversion, or those lands that provide the greatest environmental benefit? They could be different, they could be the same. So these are the kinds of questions that we would ask as part of the stakeholder engagement process to really understand what are those things that the community cares most about, and how can we accomplish those goals through TDR. So the main point being there's a lot of flexibility. The hard part is having that conversation and reaching consensus what those goals.
Thanks, Nick. And then Stephen, did you have your hand raised again, or is that an old hand? Are you there, Stephen Bramwell? You went away.
Just lowered it. Sorry about that.
Oh, okay. All right, good conversation so far. I think we're inching forward here with how we're thinking about this as a community. But since we do have some elected officials on the call, I have a kind of a moment on the agenda where I really, not to put you on the spot, and you can of course defer, but I'm curious to hear from our elected officials, right, who are in leadership roles and in making and ultimately adopting any policy changes to do with this program. And I think I'd like to give you an opportunity to say where you're coming from on this and your interests and what your priorities are for the program. And I'll just do a round robin of it and start with my Commissioner Menser.
Well, I'm curious. I mean, the goals that this program is designed to try to achieve are still paramount goals, probably more important goals than they were in 1995 when this all got started. So if I can hear a path forward, mechanisms that can help us achieve those goals, then I'm all for putting the time and energy into developing them. I guess my curiosity is, King and Snohomish are a lot bigger than us, and a lot of programs work up there that don't work here. You mentioned somewhere in Maryland. I don't know if there's an example of a very well working TDR program on a scale of Thurston County size. I'd be curious about that. But if we feel like we can, connect the dots, I'm very willing to invest that time and effort. But there are things that just don't work in Thurston County that do work in King County. So, we have to be mindful of what's possible given the scale of what we have.
Thanks for that. Danny, did you want to make a statement?
Yeah, I think people can probably sense that I'm excited about this. And I think that it's from two sides of the equation here. In Olympia, we want more density. And I think about that sustainable Thurston goal. We want, by 2035, we want 72% of people living in a walkable distance to services. And the most recent Buildable Lands report says that maybe we'll get to 57%. So we're not meeting certain goals that we want to be meeting. And like I said before, in our housing action plan, you know, we've identified TDRs as a potential tool to achieve our neighborhood center goals. And, you know, I think we should be looking along transit lines for just all tools in the toolbox for increasing density in the places that we want it. And then the other side of it is food. I've been doing a lot of work in Olympia in terms of our role in preserving farmland, both in how we as a city support regional farmland, because that is part of our local food system. You know, we want to be a food city. We want people to know that if they come to Olympia, they can go to a restaurant and get some good local food there from around the region. But also in terms of our local food system within Olympia, I stated before, we have really strong language in our comprehensive plan for preserving access for people to live near where food is being grown, whether it's them growing it themselves, whether it's them, you know, being able to just see somebody growing food, you know, whether it's in a community garden or whether it's an urban farm, or be able to access, you know, a food stand, a farm stand where they can get local food. And so we've been doing some work in collaboration with the Thurston Conservation District and the Community Farmland Trust, mapping out areas of active and potential agriculture in Olympia and the UGA. And we're looking at what we need to be doing for preservation within our area. And so, you know, how can a transfer development rights program help us achieve those goals as well? So, you know, I'm excited and eager about this work. I agree with Ty that, like, you know, we're not King County, we're not Snohomish, we don't have the same resources, we don't have the same stakeholders. And so I do think we need a robust process to figure out what's going to be successful here. And I think we'll also need a program that is adaptable over time, so we don't end up with a program that works for the next 5 years and then quickly becomes outdated, which I think is what we might have on our hands right now. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. And then I want to give Councilmember Sullivan an opportunity as well.
Thank you. So this is a program that I think is not as well known by council members, planning commissioners, and individuals who make policies. So I look at it as I would like to explore other avenues to do this, like our planning manager mentioned, you know, with having the ability to do this for mitigation. So, because I know Olympia, Lacey, and Tumwater are all three very distinctly different communities that have different priorities. You know, we have a lot with gopher and mitigation and several other species mitigation. And if that's something that we could use to have to mitigate, to preserve one to mitigate another would be an amazing, I think, solution to a lot of problems. But I do not know enough about the process to be able to say that that would be appropriate or even fit into the scenario. There's also things that we have in our high density areas. And I don't think we think about this TDR enough or have enough knowledge of it to put this in our plans and put this in our development. So I think this is something we as a city need to look at more.
Thanks for that. I don't see any other elected officials on the call. If you are one, shout it out.
Can I just add something? Since there's not an elected official from Lacey, I did have a conversation with Mayor Andy Ryder not long ago about TDRs, and he expressed an interest in, like, how can this be, how could this tool be used to really bolster development and housing along Martin Way, where there's currently a lot of work going on in terms of just the transportation corridor right there. So I'll just add that into the mix there.
Yeah, thanks for that. There is Allison knows all about it because she's working hard on this, a Martin Way corridor study that's ongoing to look at ways to kind of reinvigorate that key corridor in our community. So there are opportunities, I think, there in a lot of the projects that we're working on in our jurisdictions to connect the dots, as Commissioner Menzer was noting. And I think today's discussion is really helping define some of those dots, and it's the connection work that we have in front of us as a community and kind of right sizing that for ourselves. The things that I heard today, you know, in a question posed on the agenda, you know, what obstacles and opportunities have been shared by program users that are priorities to address. I think, you know, we've heard from folks about getting the sending area priorities, re-examining sending area priorities. Do we have that right? And then the caution around that, you know, if we're going to go away from our focus on agricultural land preservation and expand it to other things, is there a cost to that? Does that dilute the effectiveness? That seems like a whole body of work in and of itself. And then the receiving area side is an obvious one. And I heard things out of Murph and Nick and in the discussion about things like parking standards and building heights and not just the, you know, units per acre density as a trigger for using a TDR in our urban areas, but getting a little more creative in how we can turn those dials in our codes. And we have opportunities ahead of us to make code changes together, city and county. It's already on our county docket to update, to catch up to the ordinance that Leonard said they just adopted and about probably 50 others in the codes that apply to the urban growth areas as well. So that's something that we could kind of pull into that legislative process. But we need to do that work, that body of work to define what those key triggers are that we want to look at that makes sense. I'll pause there for a minute. I see Ryan has raised his hand.
Yeah, Jennifer, I was just waiting for you to bring it up, and that's the joint plans. You know, far be it for me to suggest what the county should be working on, but you know, it seems like this is something that, you know, is maybe like a next step after we adopt the joint plans. You know, for those that aren't aware, you know, the Lacey Urban Growth Area is under essentially a 2003 comprehensive plan. So, you know, it seems like we should really be focused on those, you know, primary issues before we move on to secondary ones like TDRs. So just wanted to kind of bring that up.
Fair point. And I see Sarah, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, just a thought occurred to me as I heard you sort of recapping all of our wonderful questions and thoughts about the development of a really robust and well-functioning program. And, you know, I'm curious if maybe we can look initially in the program development to keep it small and simple and try it as a pilot, perhaps. Because I just listening to you talk about the breadth of work and information that we have asked for and would like to identify in this, you know, this sounds like a very long-term goal that will take many years to have a functioning program. Meanwhile, you know, the conversion rates of farm and forest land in our community are astronomical and continue to skyrocket. And so we're bleeding farmland and forest land. And I would hesitate at developing such a robust and comprehensive program at the risk of continuing to lose land that we're trying to protect and preserve at such a high rate right now. So I'm, you know, I guess my thoughts would be if we can try a pilot, keep it simple, find a model that functions, and then look at expansion over time of something that might be the most efficient to meet these conservation goals at the same time.
I think, yeah, thank you for that. It can start to feel a little overwhelming when you think of maybe all the changes that are needed. But also, I think there's an opportunity to do them in more bite-sized chunks. So, for example, one immediate bite-sized chunk is Olympia's recently adjusted its ordinance. The county can make similar changes to the urban growth area. We can, in our upcoming work on our joint plans, ensure that the policies are in place that link to the program. That's another sort of bite-sized chunk. It's already docketed. We already have people working on this. We could pull together maybe a smaller stakeholder group, maybe with a third-party facilitator. That's a manageable size and well represents the different interests to help define short-term and long-term actions. There's some short-term actions I have heard about education, about our elected officials on this program. So there may be work there that, you know, the various planning departments can do, internal education. And there's education and outreach that the county could do. The issue of resources has come up many times, and we have maybe a 1/10 of an FTE working on TDR. And then, you know, I've been trying to lean into it a little bit more these past couple of years, but it's not a lot. But there are some things we can do around outreach, even within the bounds of the current program and how it's set up, to ensure that both our internal staff are trained up, and sort of, if you get a call from a developer seeking a development right, you know who to send them to, and outreach to our agricultural community about the options, and our development community. And I'm looking at Jason when I say that, and about the fact that we have these options, and we do have zoning districts, and we do have rules in place where these can be used. So maybe we haven't even pushed that far enough. So I think there's different actions to be done on all of these different fronts concurrently. And some will be shorter term and more manageable, and some will be longer term and maybe take something like a third party to help us really make a more robust program. Those are just my 3 cents, and I'm gonna make sure Sierra has a chance with a hand raised.
Hey, thank you. I'm still struggling with this program conceptually, and I think it's relevant to how it might be applied here in Thurston County. So we develop our zoning regulations based on the type of growth that we want to see, right? And what this program does is it allows people to step beyond those zoning regulations. And I've heard caution against down zoning so that you can sell up to what you actually want to see. And I've heard caution against de-incentivizing high density development in the city. So what I am kind of curious about is what zoning regulation are we really okay with exceeding? Like, what do we want to say, hey, this is where you can step over the line and you can protect farmland to step over the line in this one area? And how does the program say, okay, well, we only want 8 houses per acre, but really 9 houses is okay. And you know, we can protect fit, we can do all kinds of fantastic stuff with this, as long as we identify that area where we're willing to allow potentially more development than we thought was appropriate. And so that's the piece that I keep struggling with. Where are we gonna decide in Thurston County, or how, what regulation do we want to identify as, hey, you can step over this regulation? Does that question even make sense to people? Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Are any of the nodders willing to take a stab at that one? I'll let you just jump in before I move on to Scott, who had his hand raised next.
I will, just real quickly, by way of example, King County's jargon that we use, and this I know plays out in other cities within the county, and I expect other cities across the country, and counties for that matter, is the base density, and then on top of that, the bonus density. And there are a variety of ways that in King County's comprehensive plan policies, we've identified sort of what we see as valid trading chits, for lack of a better way to put it, to get to access that additional bonus density. Affordable housing obviously is a big one. Provision of open space on site or adjacent to a development is another way to get that bonus density. So just to your point, Sierra, the way we structure that in King County and some cities within the county do is base density, bonus density, And really what the planners are contemplating is what's the maximum density that we want to get here. That's the, the top of the bonus. But then, is there anything that we want to, sorry, this is an inartful word, but extract from the development community to achieve that bonus or to access that bonus? And that's the construct that is sort of at play in King County.
Is that not down zoning?
We have not done a down zone in King County. Well, we did effectively it was a 2005 roughly through a critical areas ordinance, but we see TDR and the protections that come as something totally different. When the critical areas ordinances came into being in the 2005 timeframe, that limited development in our rural area a lot. We still allow theoretical, although hard to actualize, density to transfer from areas that are protected by critical areas regulations. For instance, if we've got a site that's 100% wetland, that's 20 acres, zoned RA5, we still allow transfers of development rights from that. So that's a regulatory downzoning of sorts that is not the same as a downzone, but same effect. We still allow TDRs to do it there. But we don't have a case in King County, at least, where we have done for a long time, at least, for a broad scale down zone. But that's how Montgomery County did it. They down zoned their ag areas and said to the owners that got down zoned, you can keep your transferable development rights, and we're going to create a market for you to sell those. So that's one way to generate supply, is by down zoning and then gifting TDRs that result.
Thanks for that. I'm going to have Nick be able to respond because I think he has something to say directly on this question. And then I'll get to you, Scott, with your hand.
Yeah, thanks. Murph's explanation is great. And to expand upon that, what I'm hearing in the question from Sarah and then also earlier from Lynn is maybe at its simplest is, why don't local governments just set the zoning at whatever they want the growth to be? And the answer is, yeah, you can do that. The trade-off there is that you're leaving the value of public benefit on the table. So when cities or counties upzone or expand their UGAs or annex, they're making a legislative decision that changes land use that increases the value of that land. So great example, Snohomish County, I keep going back to that because that was a program I was involved in the design of. Got rural zone land at R5, so 1 unit per 5 acres, immediately next to land in the UGA that's zoned 6 units per acre. So you expand that UGA and suddenly you've got suburban level zoning. That's a 30-fold increase in the development potential of land that's brought into the UGA. So just by a legislative decision, you've radically increased the value of that land, because now you can build 30 times as many homes on it as you could before. And so the question there is, can we create some kind of public benefit by taking a portion of that additional value that gets created and directing that to conservation? And I think, as we've seen successfully in this region and elsewhere, the answer is yes. And Murph is spot on. I mean, when you set these thresholds for using the program, you have a maximum by right density in mind. Like, here's what we'd like to see, and here's what we're willing to grant to anybody who wants to build at this level. And if somebody wants to go above that, up to a certain point, they can do so, but they need to purchase TDR credits or provide affordable housing and some combination of those things. And then the broader community benefits from the provision of those additional goods. So
I really appreciate that explanation. That just made it clear.
Hit for you?
There's a desire to upzone, and who's going to get the benefit from that? Is it just the private landowners that already are owning that property, or can we make a public good from that upzoning? Yeah. So thank you.
I also appreciate that.
Yeah, I think that I'm gonna get to you, Scott, but I think this came up. One of our ag advisory committee members brought this up in some recent discussions I was having with him about if we see rural rezones occur where you're intensifying the use or the density in the rural area, can that be a trigger for requiring or somehow attaching, needing to, buy TDRs or retire TDR credits? So an innovative and interesting thought there as well. I think there are other places where when our land converts or develops, or we expand a boundary or we upzone something, that can be linked to the use of TDRs. And I don't think we've really gone that direction necessarily yet as a community. So I'm going to turn to Scott, who's been patiently waiting.
Right. So I guess one thing about expanding it, I think it's a great idea, but I will caution that TDR was a promise made to landowners in 1995. And I've got some rough numbers here that aren't exactly 100%, but that was about 12,000 acres that changed from 1 in 5 zoning to 1 in 20 zoning, which would have been 2,400 lots, reduced down to 600. And I think at the beginning of the presentation, we saw that there was 44 sold so far. That is not a successful program. So that would be my worry about expanding it now. And I think the next step has to be the cities sitting down with, whether it's the individual builders or BIAW or Olympia Master Builders, whatever it is, and you need to figure out where you want this development to go. Because 100%, 25 years, the problem is we don't have the receiving areas. And I'll tell you this, because I just thought of this recently. I am 47. My uncle was a part of this program when it was first set up. And he was younger than I am now. He just passed away at 68. And this is where we're at. So as somebody who's 5th generation Thurston County, 5th generation full-time farmer in Thurston County, I can tell you, and I'll add this, 15 years on the Thurston County Planning Commission. Thurston County has done very little in my lifetime to help agriculture. And I don't think that's an understatement. And I think the problem is Thurston County tends to listen to so-called experts. Somebody that lives somewhere that wants to see you do something and then walks right over the top of me to do it. And I have to respond to this. Loretta Sapanen responded to Danny's question about commercially available ag. Number one, I'm going to say 15,000 acres is a huge overstatement. Number two, you cannot compare commercially significant ag in different counties because we have different land, different systems set up. So, like I said, my biggest concern is instead of the cities looking to the county to do something, I think the county needs to look to the cities to do something so that there is a receiving area that is viable for not only me and other people to sell our rights, but for developers to buy them and at least make a little bit of money being able to do it. Because if they're losing money, they're not going to do it. And what do they care? Because if it's zone 4 to 8 in 20 years, we run out of room and the city's going to change the zoning to 8 to 12. And so they'll get the money back at some point.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate that. I can feel your passion behind it. And it's, I see that passion in our farming community a lot. I have been working a lot with our Ag Advisory Committee and I've had lots of conversations with farmers through this ongoing project we have to look at all of our ag policies and programs. And there is a widely held perspective that, we need to do more to support our local farming community, and there's continued loss and threats against that community. And so heard for sure. And then I want to go to my hands raised. So I have Allison, followed by Liv, followed by Lynn. So go ahead, Allison.
Thanks. I mean, I think these are all really good points. I think one thing to think about that I think has been highlighted is that in any next steps involves, I think, that there's a lot of enthusiasm for the mechanism of TDR, but it should be better designed to meet Thurston County's specific conditions. I think traditionally TDR, as we've heard it described today, has been the idea that the value of open space lands, whether that's agriculture or some other uses, then comes from a rural area and gets invested then in an urban area. Folks brought up the Buildable Lands Report, our Sustainable Thurston Targets for our urban corridors, and the Martin Way study. And what we're seeing in our urban areas is that we are not achieving our targets for urban density. And on Martin Way, we've got some recent research and saying that part of that is because we do not have the market conditions to support the level of intense development that we have a vision for in some of those corridors. It's starting to happen in some areas like downtown Olympia. So a TDR program can have a lot of benefits, but that traditional way it's set up around tying it to urban density does create a barrier. And so I think if we may want to think about it, I think Sierra's point was really well taken, and there were some really great examples that our speakers have brought up, thinking beyond density, thinking about what is it that would help us achieve the vision we have for our community, and how do we value and trade on that. Even if that means looking at what are we trading within our rural areas for the type of development. Thurston County is very, very different from King County. We do not have in our rural areas, it is most of it's in private ownership, which is very different from other areas. Most of it is zoned for 1 to 5. Even if you were to preserve a down zoning, most of it's already parceled at 5 acres. So those kinds of tools are not going to work in our system the way they might in another area. So any kind of program should look really specifically at our market conditions and our vision here, and think about how those things could match up. Because I think there's a lot of opportunity there. It just, as folks have brought up, it needs to be really targeted to what works for us here.
Great. Couldn't agree more. I'm going to go to Liv, she's gone through it and has bought and applied rights to a project. And so I think hearing from you, Liv, it's something I've been waiting for. Go ahead. And you're muted. You have to unmute.
I really appreciate hearing what Scott said as a sender, as you're calling them, and I was a receiver, as you're calling them, or what do you call it, buyer, whatever. But I'm not your typical buyer, and I'm the one who bought. And we bought because we were building a small co-housing community. We wanted high density so we could have more people close in the city, and keeping as much of our ground as possible. Our roadblocks were working with the city of Olympia a bit. We would not get any extra density permits from them, even though their forward-looking plan was to have more density. We were very glad to be able to buy 2 TDRs in order to build 2 more homes on our piece of land and keep enough green space to have lots of green space. So I think we're not a typical developer. I never thought of myself as a developer, being one of a group of people who are wanting to build something to live on. Financially, it felt crazy to me that we couldn't even build to the 8 density that the lot said, the 4 to 8, without buying TDRs for the last 8. I was very pleased today to hear that maybe we will get to a 9th one. Maybe we can actually put a 9th one on sometime. I'm not sure if that's a true thing for the future of a piece that's already been mostly developed. But the reason that we bought was because we were building a community that lived our values, and our values are the same as the values of the farmers. We want this land this density in town. And I don't think that is the main value of most developers. I think the main thing that they're working for is making a profit. And I think that what he said, I agree with totally, that the whole place to work on this is finding the receivers. You need to find the people that are going to be, buying these TDRs and make it really work for them, or it's not gonna work. It's been fun really listening to this conversation as kind of an outsider, but that's my kind of take.
Thank you, Liv. You're an insider now. Sorry to tell you. Okay. I'm going to jump to Lynn, and then following that, we'll go to Leonard.
Yeah, this may seem off topic, but I think it's kind of got to be part of the discussion. So a lot of how throughout our whole country we've zoned farmland is based on what has become the popular model of farming, which is monocropping, which means, really huge pieces of land in order to do the scale that you do in monocropping. And yet, for lots of reasons, our climate mitigation plan being one of them, we need to move more in the direction of regenerative agriculture, which also draws carbon down into the land, very critical. But regenerative agriculture is not done on that scale. It isn't, typically you wouldn't have a huge farm in order to do that. And so, one of the problems here about transfer of farms from old farmers to younger farmers is younger farmers are wanting smaller pieces of land, and yet there's a huge danger if we start letting farmland be broken up, that really it just stops being farmed, that it's seized by developers at that point. So I hope as we look at changes that we might make, that we can also figure out how to create divided farmland that remains farmland.
Thanks for that, Lynn. Leonard.
Well, I just really appreciate all the conversation here and everyone getting together and seeing the enthusiasm for this tool, as someone mentioned earlier, and trying to make it work better. I do agree with Scott that the probably the main obstacle in this county program has been there's not enough incentive in the receiving areas. I hope the change that we recently made in Olympia helps address that. But I also want to point out one other opportunity, as Allison was saying, that it's not around density, but other things. It was mentioned earlier that parking, sort of buying down parking requirements had been in other places had been effective. And I do want to point out and remind all three of our cities that in our recently completed housing action plans, that was also pointed out as something that could help with housing costs and producing housing supply that we need. So especially around affordability of housing. So I think there's a real good connection here. And I think we intend, Councilmember Madrone and I have been chatting here a little bit about the possibilities of looking at this in Olympia, because we already intended to look at our parking requirements. And we tend as cities to require more parking than actually is needed at this point for a lot of types of development, because house sizes are so much smaller than they used to be, number of people living in individual units. And so looking at reducing our parking requirements, but tying that to a transfer development right that can help preserve farm and possibly forest land in the future, in the long term, seems like there's a lot of connections here. And so I'd encourage other cities as well to look at that part of our housing action plan and how can that be connected with the TDR program and some changes there to incentivize the receiving areas.
Thanks, Leonard. Yeah, that seems like a concrete, we're probably at the point of the conversation where we're reaching for concrete next steps. That's what we should be talking about at this point on the agenda. And I think we're getting there. And that seems to be one that we could all individually explore as jurisdictions too, is that parking requirement piece as we go through comb through our codes and make our updates. That seems to be something concrete we could be focusing on. So I'm writing that down for sure, but Stephen has his hand raised. Go ahead, Stephen.
Thanks. Yeah. I'm not really in a position to sort of challenge the points being made here because I'm not a growth management specialist, but it's just sort of an outsider who works on farming. It just feels like we should also, while recognizing the limitations of the market, challenge our assumptions that the market is not there for this kind of work. I mean, we've just seen land prices go bonkers and home prices go bonkers, and a lot of development occurring. So it seems to me there's energy that could be harnessed. And one kind of lay person's perspective on this is like, are we not drawing the boundary firm enough? Because you can't force people to push up if you allow them to spread out. And so, if that makes sense, what are the urban growth boundaries? What's happening with annexations? How do you tighten some of that in order to force the energy into the core? So again, not a developer or an urban growth development specialist, but those are kind of my just observations.
Thanks, Stephen. Lots of dials that are turned at simultaneously and concurrently under growth management on both sides of this growth equation. So I appreciate that ag perspective and the need to kind of challenge ourselves and our assumptions about what's going on in our market. I think that's really important. So Scott, did you have your hand raised again?
Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to talk about, you're talking about the way forward. And I think one thing is, especially when we start doing this, is we need to not limit ourselves to bonus density. Let's look at everything that it costs money to do and what can we change. Maybe there's, and I'll use this one because it seems like a easy transition. Maybe the cities can give a development a break on open space if they're buying development rights from outside in the county, because you're providing open space. It may not be the same, but a lot of developments have open space that isn't like a little park or anything. It's just land that they set aside.
Thanks for that, Scott. Danny, I saw your hand pop up.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm really, really loving this conversation and feeling super stimulated. And it's really aligned with a lot of the housing challenges that we're having in Olympia in terms of cost to build and all the requirements that have been put on over time. Leonard touched on parking, but we've got a whole matrix of things that we're looking at in terms of the barriers for development. And so I just want to thank everybody for this conversation. It's just, I think it's going to influence, some of the conversations that we're having in the city of Olympia to address like both sides of this issue.
Thank you. Are there any other wise thoughts about some immediate next steps or concrete next steps that we can take as a community? I think we have individual challenges as jurisdictions that we can turn around and look at our codes and kind of comb through and see where we might make adjustments on the receiving area side, which does seem to be like a major piece of the puzzle here. I think there is an opportunity to think about a follow-up regional working group or several working groups that could be put together and facilitated. I do think that the concept of having outside facilitation or neutral facilitation is helpful since there are so many fingers in this program. Or is there, and what about timing? And what about, like Sarah said, there's immediate need to do more. But all of our legislative processes, and as Ryan points out, we're in the middle of doing a lot of them and it takes a lot of time. And don't we need to get our houses in order before we can, then turn to a project like this? I'm trying to take the temperature of the group of anybody with a concrete idea about a next step. And if we don't today, that's fine too, because what is going to happen on my end and our end is writing up the notes to this, making this recording widely available. It'll be sent to everyone on the invite list. It'll be posted on the Thurston County website. And maybe that could be used in your various groups and committees to kind of stimulate conversation and then maybe have, you know, some email exchanges and healthy dialogue about concrete next steps. And obviously on Commissioner Mentzer's desk is, you know, a budget request to look at, you know, professional services contract work to help support this, and an ag liaison position for Thurston County on the staffing side of things. So I think we all have things we can focus on after this, but I'm curious about next steps from folks real quick. And Nick raised his hand, so I'll go to Nick.
Thank you, Jennifer. One recommendation I have for next steps is to keep the regional coordination conversation front and center. I think what we have here today is a great example of a strength that Thurston County has in its respective communities, that countywide engagement and the participation for cities in with this purpose. I'm hearing a consensus for expanding conservation. I'm hearing a consensus around wanting to encourage urban growth. And I'm hearing a consensus around like wanting to coordinate. So I think that's a really important starting place to launch from. If that's not something that common, you know, in other communities, TDR programs have at different points in time and are not necessarily coordinated in kind of an integrated way as I've been hearing in this conversation. So the fact that you've got multiple jurisdictions within the county who are all interested in the same result and are all interested in working together is a really valuable strength to build this program upon. More, I like the facilitation idea. And just as a general comment, I encourage this group or some formation of it to continue the conversation. This level of regional coordination, I think, has the potential to do much more than just the county or individual states acting unilaterally to improve the use of the tool.
Thanks, Nick. And we do have the benefit as a smaller community of being so connected to one another, and through Thurston Regional Planning Council as well. We have those forums in place where we can continue these conversations, and that is a really plus for us. Any other comments about immediate next steps that anyone else would like to see or offer up to the group? Our tummies are probably rumbling at this point. Okay, and Stephen, I'm assuming that's an old hand I see raised, or did you have a new question or comment? Oh, he took it down. All right, I will say that there were several invitees who didn't make it today for one reason or another, and most of those were from our agriculture community. We had several, farmers invited to join, and I know, thank you, Scott, and anyone else, and Sarah, I know you're also a farmer, and anyone else who farms. And Loretta, thank you for being here to represent those interests. And we'll continue. They are part of this group, so there will be follow-up communication with those folks who couldn't make it, but were invited, including several of our Ag Advisory Committee members. And as I said, after this, we'll provide the recording and notes from this meeting. And we'll be thinking about on our end some more immediate next steps that we can do as a county, and I would appreciate that work from all our partners in the community as well. And then maybe we can think about getting back together once we've contemplated that and having a follow-up conversation. Are there any other thoughts to share, or questions or needs for the good of the order? Oh, Danny had a hand raised.
I just want to specifically thank you, Jennifer, for your work in bringing this together. It's such a great conversation, and bringing all the different interests and governments into the room is it's just so important. And I just want to say I appreciate your work.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I've been working on TDR since grad school, so that's a long time ago, unfortunately. And so I'm hopeful and excited to see how it might work a little better in Thurston County and elsewhere in the state. So thank you for that. All right, with that, I'm very respectful of people's time, and it's 11:53, and how dare us end 7 minutes early, but I think we can and will. And I thank you for all your participation and good thoughts. Thank you to all the people here from Department of Commerce, who I'll be contacting for money soon to help us do this. So thanks for being here. And I look forward to speaking to each and every one of you in our different forums. So, and special thanks to Nick and Murph for being here and for sharing. That was so instructive. And I think, aspirational maybe where you guys live in your worlds, but I think that's good for us to know and have as goals. So thank you. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you.